a ring box abandoned before the altar. Welcome to Mysteries Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Tell me in the comments where you're joining from. Your presence makes these mysteries unforgettable. Let's begin the tale. The Sunday morning sun slanted warmly across the thatched rooftops of St. Mary Mead, glinting off dew-tipped roses and the narrow panes of the high street shops. Bells from St. Clement's Church pealed across the village green, summoning the congregation for the 11 o'clock service. Mrs. Agnes Hartwell, whose briskness in both step and opinion was well known, was the first to mount the stone steps to the church porch. She was halfway through mentally cataloguing who had failed to polish their brass door knockers that week when her eyes fell upon a curious object. It was a small, velvet-covered ring box, the sort that holds an engagement ring. The deep red velvet was slightly scuffed, but its brass clasp shone, catching the light. It sat neatly, almost ceremoniously, in the centre of the top step, as if someone had placed it there to be found. Agnes bent to pick it up, glancing about. A few villagers were approaching along the path. Mr. Pettigrew the verger, with his usual air of mild disapproval. Young Elsie Cranford, clutching her hymn book and walking quickly. And, at a more measured pace, Miss Marple herself, her delicate pink hat just visible over the heads of the crowd. Curiosity outweighing propriety, Agnes flicked open the box's clasp. Inside, nestled in faded satin, lay a gold ring set with a pale, almost watery sapphire. The stone's gentle shimmer seemed oddly out of place in the morning sunlight, beautiful, yet unsettling. "Oh!" Agnes's exclamation drew Elsie nearer. "What is it, Mrs. Hartwell?" the girl asked, peering in. But before Agnes could reply, a sound made everyone freeze, the sharp intake of breath from Mr. Pettigrew. His face had gone quite pale. "That's—" He stopped himself, darting a look at Miss Marple, who had now reached the steps. Miss Marple's blue eyes, clear as the summer sky, rested on the ring box with mild interest, as though she were looking at nothing more consequential than a mislaid glove. "What a pretty little thing," she murmured. "One does wonder, though, why anyone would leave it here on a Sunday morning, when they knew the entire village would be passing." Inside the church, the organ began its opening chords, yet no one moved toward the doorway. Even the vicar, Reverend Coles, had stepped out from the porch to see what the delay was. It was then that a faint, distant cry carried on the breeze, a woman's voice, sharp with distress. Heads turned toward the lane that led past the lich gate and down toward the meadow. A figure was running toward them, Maggie Renshaw, her face white, her hands shaking. Her voice broke as she reached the steps. "It's Emily Foster. She's in the meadow. She's—" But whatever she meant to say was swallowed by the gasps of those nearest. For beyond the lich gate, a small knot of villagers had gathered, motionless, around something, or someone, lying in the long grass. Miss Marple's gaze lingered a moment on the ring, then lifted toward the meadow, her expression unreadable. "I think," she said softly, "that our service will be somewhat delayed this morning." They moved as one organism at first, hesitation and curiosity bound up together, across the gravel, through the lich gate, and along the narrow path that silvered through the grass. The meadow had been cut the week before, so the ground beneath their feet was uneven with stubble and sweet-smelling hay. Miss Marple's step was unhurried. She did not push or crane. She had seen many crowds like this in many villages. The voices change, the hats and hems change, but the impulses are so very alike. Emily Foster lay not far from the hawthorn hedge, on her side as if she had simply chosen to sleep in an inconvenient place. Her dress, a simple blue cotton with white piping at the collar, seemed quite in order. One could, if one wished, pretend she might wake and scold them for standing about her. But Mrs. Renshaw's keening told a different story, and the carefully held distance of those nearest confirmed it. There was a damp, darker patch beneath Emily's cheek, where the grass had been pressed. The skin of her face held the waxy stillness that even the most resolute denial cannot dismiss. Dr. Haydock was already kneeling, having appeared from the lane with the quiet swiftness of a man used to being needed at awkward moments. He touched the girl's wrist, then the side of her throat, then, almost apologetically, parted the hair near her ear. "Yes," he said, not loudly. "Best not gather close." His eyes flicked to Reverend Coles. "If you'd be so good as to take Mrs. Renshaw back toward the porch. Miss Cranford, with you." Maggie let herself be guided without protest, her distress having settled into that glassy obedience that follows a shock. Mr. Pettigrew had hung back at the last, as if restrained by an invisible thread. His mouth worked once, then closed. Agnes Hartwell, whose curiosity could surge past a great many things, stopped when she reached Miss Marple's shoulder. "Dreadful," Agnes whispered, without yet deciding for whom. "And the ring. What do you suppose?" "Supposition is an active sport," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes on the hedge. "It burns up the facts very quickly." Agnes, not entirely rebuked, tightened her grip on her handbag and made a small sound that did for a nod. The organ had faltered and stopped. The vicar, with the air of a man at once bereft of his proper words and full of superfluous ones, said, Yes, let us go back to the church. We can give thanks later for lives in general." He was not a foolish man, only an unprepared one, which is to say a man like most others. Word travelled with a peculiar delicacy that morning. Children were briskly turned toward home, baskets were lifted and set down again without purpose, and front doors opened as if catching the news from the air. Names arrived ahead of people. Emily Foster, you know, the one from Old Post Cottage. And past tense crept in with indecent speed. In the porch, the ring box had acquired a radius. No one stepped within it, though Elsa Cranford cast little glances, like a young cat in a room with an unfamiliar chair. Miss Marple did not join the cluster of murmurers. She stood by the lich gate, where a stray thread of white wool had caught on the iron latch and fluttered. A churchwarden's mother might have mended it in an instant, but things had the poor taste to occur before proper mending could be done. Miss Marple glanced from the wisp to the path, as if testing the grain. The grass on the meadow side showed scuffs and one deeper gouge at the verge, as though a heel had turned too hard. Colonel Melchett and Inspector Slack arrived not long after, the former with the measured sobriety that suited him, the latter with his habitual impatience already twitching under the skin. Slack bowed his head the proper amount when Dr. Haydock stood to meet him, but his eyes were calculating the space, the people, the points at which lines might cross. "All right," Slack said. "We'll clear this. Colonel, perhaps—" "Not heavy-handed, Slack," Melchett said mildly. "There's been enough upset." "Quite, sir, but order doesn't arrive of its own accord." He turned. "Reverend, if you'd keep your lot in the porch and the nave for now. We'll want names of those who were present. Mr. Pettigrew with me." Mr. Pettigrew jumped. "Me? You were here first, weren't you?" Slack's gaze was keen. Who touched what and when, that sort of thing. It was Agnes Hartwell who had opened the ring box, and she told them so at once, flushed with the thrill of being both culpable and useful. "It was sitting in the middle of the top step," she said, articulating each word to make it respectable. "Not dropped, you understand, placed. Anyone can see the difference. And inside, a sapphire, pale as morning milk. I don't care for pale stones. I've always said—" "Thank you," Slack said, not caring for stones in any shade. "Was it there when you arrived, Pettigrew?" Pettigrew's hands, which were usually folded in a posture of reproachful tolerance, would not quite be still. Yes. I saw Agnes pick it up." "You reacted," Miss Marple said, so gently one might think she admired him for it. Pettigrew startled again, then looked at her and, oddly, relaxed. "I thought I recognized it. Perhaps I was wrong." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. In the porch, whispers braided themselves into a kind of low chorus. Emily and that young carpenter. What's his name? Thomas Reed, someone supplied. There was talk. Not scandal, another corrected primly, which is how scandal announces itself. She wore no ring last week at the fete. Well, not everyone gets asked with a ring these days. Economy, said a voice with the bright sound of thrift turned into virtue. Elsie Cranford had stationed herself near the pillar, fingers pressed to her hymn book so hard the cover creased. She looked at Miss Marple with the open relief of the very young toward the very old. Miss Marple, she said, then stopped, as if asking a question without the courage to put it into words, because the answer would make the day real. It is very sad, my dear, Miss Marple said simply, which allowed Elsie to nod as if something had been agreed upon and could not be argued with. Did you know Emily well? Not well, no. She worked mornings at Mr. Kersey's shop sometimes, helping with parcels, you know, then afternoons at the tea room on market days. She was nice, reserved. People sometimes said she was proud, but it wasn't that. She listened more than she spoke. That can look like pride if one is used to filling silences. Elsie blinked, surprised at her own eloquence. Miss Marple's eyes creased in approval. Exactly so. Had she any relations? A stepmother, Mrs. Foster. She keeps bees, out toward Longacre. And a cousin who came down in the spring, Louisa Price. Only for a fortnight. She didn't take to the village. She wore shoes like blades. Elsie coloured, as if the remark were quite improper. Blade shoes can be fatiguing, Miss Marple said gravely. And Mr. Thomas Reed. Elsie's gaze darted to the ring box and away. Everyone says, but I don't know. He brought a chair into the tea room once to show Emily how he'd mended its leg. They looked not in love, perhaps. In agreement. Agreement can be a calmer thing, Miss Marple said. It can also be very fragile. Inspector Slack had finished with Pettigrew and was now conferring with the Colonel and Dr. Haydock. No obvious injuries, Haydock said, his mouth a thin line of disapproval at the limits of his role. A bruise at the temple. Could be a fall. Could be something else. She's been dead. An hour, perhaps 2. The dew's nearly off, but the cool kept her. Longer than one might think. A fall, Slack repeated sceptically, as if the word had betrayed him in the past. And the ring box on the steps, that's not nothing. Melchett glanced at the lane. We'll have to speak to Mrs. Foster. We will, Slack said. He looked at the box again, then at Miss Marple, as if the old lady and the small velvet object were part of the same category of mild inconveniences. You were on the steps when it was found, Miss Marple. I was approaching. Mrs. Hartwell picked it up. Mr. Pettigrew, I think, saw it as we all did. It is interesting, isn't it, how a thing can be both public and private. A ring is an intimate promise, but a church step is very public. People like to send messages that way. Messages, Slack said. Yes, or they like their little dramas. We'll have facts, if you please, not sentiments. Facts, Miss Marple agreed serenely, are made by sentiments as often as by stones. He made a noise that could mean anything. Reverend Coles. We'll have names and addresses of those present, and the times they arrived. Dr. Haydock, the usual. Colonel, I'll send a constable to Old Post Cottage. No one to go near Mrs. Foster without me. Quite right, Melchett said. Miss Marple, if you would. I shall go home and make tea, Miss Marple said placidly. It is astonishing how restorative a cup can be, and I expect Mrs. Price, the cousin, does not like to drink hers alone, if indeed she is still in the village. She isn't, Agnes Hartwell interposed, unable to help herself. Left in May, said the place was a snow globe of dullness. That was her phrase. Not that I object to snow globes. Then perhaps Mrs. Foster will have honey, Miss Marple said, almost to herself. People who keep bees often do. The congregation, such as it was, resisted dispersal in the manner of anybody that has been brought together and given purpose, however dismal. Slack posted a constable at the meadow edge and another by the porch. The bell rope hung slack inside, as if it too were considering whether to assist. Miss Marple waited until the first wave of questions had exhausted itself into repetitions. She was considering the box, its velvet worn thin on the hinge, as if it had been opened many times. The satin inside had a tiny nick near the corner, the kind made by a pin or a very small buckle. The clasp shone more than the rest, bright where fingers would press, cleaned, perhaps, with a dab of metal polish. One saw such brightness on door latches and picture hooks in very tidy houses, and on candlesticks in houses that are tidy only on Sundays. There was also, in the air by the box, a faint breath of something. Lavender, yes, but with a green edge, like lavender hung to dry near herbs. Miss Marple could not claim noses as a specialty. She had known a terrier with a better one. But a life in small rooms teaches a person what belongs and what is slightly off. She found Reverend Coles beside her and patted his sleeve. "You have done very well," she said kindly. "I feel a very silly man," he confessed, with the frankness of someone who would never tell what he had heard in confidence, and so must let out honesty somewhere. "I preached last week on peace, and now—" "Peace is not a weather condition," Miss Marple said. "It does not hold simply because one announces it. No one blames the meteorologist." He managed half a smile. "If you see Mrs. Foster before I do, perhaps don't tell her more than you must. I will come as soon as I can." "Of course." Miss Marple's gaze had drifted again to Mr. Pettigrew. He was talking to Elsie now, very gently, yet his kindness seemed to run in a measured channel, as if he were careful not to spill any. Slack reappeared with a notebook. "Emily Foster, age 20, Agnes supplied at once, or thereabouts. She was christened at St. Clement's. I have the notice somewhere. Her father was that quiet Mr. Foster, who never raised his voice and died in his garden, sitting on a stool. Heart, they said. But my cousin had a cousin who—" "Thank you," Slack said again, pencil moving. "Affianced to one Thomas Reed." "You'd have to ask them," Agnes said reproachfully, enjoying the caution of it. "No one tells me anything directly. I would much prefer directness." "Reed?" Slack repeated, as if writing the name on the air. "We'll have him found." Miss Marple turned toward the path. "Inspector, if I might take the ring box, only to prevent its becoming a magnet for well-meaning fingers. I shall keep it safe and bring it along presently." Slack hesitated, frowning at the notion of giving an object to a person not wearing a uniform. Colonel Melchett said, "Miss Marple's discretion has served us before, Slack." "Very well," Slack said grudgingly. "No one else is to touch it until we've had it looked over." He was the sort of man who does not easily permit a thing to be looked over by someone not of his choosing. But Miss Marple had the advantage of being both improbable and inevitable. She closed the lid with care, as one might lay a teacup back in its saucer. The clasp clicked, a small, bright sound in the warm air. The crowd breathed with it, as if the act had drawn a thread through the morning and knotted it. Miss Marple slipped the box into the pocket of her cardigan, where it sat with the mild weight of a secret that was waiting, not straining. On her way through the lich gate, she paused again. The thread of white wool fluttered still, and she pinched it free, no longer than the length of a thumb. Not from a coarse scarf, finer than that. Something summer weight, loosely knitted. She did not lecture herself for keeping it. Old ladies are allowed a little thrift with scraps. "Miss Marple?" It was Elsie coming up shyly. "If you see Mrs. Foster, would you tell her—" She faltered. "I mean only that Emily once lent me a book and didn't make me give it back until I'd finished. People don't always do that." "I shall tell her that Emily had patience," Miss Marple said. "That is a very particular kindness." Elsie nodded hard and looked away, because tears are much more stubborn in public. Miss Marple walked home along the lane with her familiar, careful tread, greeting a hedgehog in the ditch and noting the clean sweep of someone's doorstep. She did not hurry. Hurrying seldom brings one to the right conclusion sooner. It only makes one arrive breathless. In her cottage, she put the kettle on and took down the honey jar someone had left for her last week. "For your throat, Miss Marple, and because the bees have been industrious," Mrs. Foster had said. The label was written in a neat hand that pressed evenly on the paper, with no letters leaning into one another for support. She set the honey by the tray, and after a moment, took the ring box from her pocket, laying it on the tablecloth. The velvet, in this light, looked darker, the scuff at the edge more like a bruise than a blemish. She did not open it again. There is a kind of rudeness in making a thing repeat itself only to satisfy one's own fidget. Instead, she looked out of the window at the privet hedge and the distant roof of Old Post Cottage beyond, and thought about agreements made quietly and messages left publicly, about lavender that smells of gardens and lavender that smells of cupboards, and about young girls who listen more than they speak. When the kettle sang, she poured, and as the steam rose, she decided that honey would indeed be wanted where she was going. Not for the tea only, for the conversation. People will say more readily what they mean when sweetness is within reach, and they need not ask for it. Miss Marple wrapped the honey jar in a clean tea towel, tucking it into her basket alongside a small plate of shortbread she had baked the previous afternoon. She did not always bring food when she visited, but there were occasions, this was one, when arriving with something in hand gave the caller a certain legitimacy. People were more willing to open their doors to what they thought of as kindness than to curiosity, though the two were not always entirely separate. The lane to Longacre wound between hedgerows thick with summer growth, the air heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and the faint tang of creosote from some recently mended fence. The sun was warm but not oppressive, the kind of day that ought to have been filled with bees and the slow creak of a garden gate. Mrs. Foster's cottage stood just beyond a gap in the hedge, low-roofed and whitewashed, its small windows glinting in the light. The hives were arranged in neat rows at the far end of the garden, each painted a different pastel shade, lavender, cream, pale green, as if they had been chosen to soothe the bees into cooperation. A faint hum carried on the air, the sound of life going on in spite of what had happened in the meadow. Miss Marple opened the wicket gate and stepped onto the flagged path, noting the swept tidiness of the front step and the absence of any lingering cobwebs along the lintel. Someone had done their housekeeping early that morning. She had almost reached the door when it opened abruptly, revealing Mrs. Foster herself. The woman was in her early 50s, though her face carried the tautness of someone who had been older for some years already. She wore a plain cotton dress and an apron streaked faintly with pollen dust. Her eyes, light brown, quick, ran over Miss Marple and the basket, and the lines around her mouth softened, if only slightly. "Miss Marple," she said, as though weighing the name for its purpose. "I heard the bells stop. I knew something had happened, but no one's been up yet to say." Miss Marple inclined her head, the basket still cradled on her arm. "It is bad news, I'm afraid. I thought perhaps you might take some tea, with honey, of course." Mrs. Foster stepped back at once, the motion almost brisk. "Come in then. No sense talking on the doorstep." The front room smelled faintly of beeswax and drying lavender, with a sharper note beneath that Miss Marple recognized as the tang of propolis. The furniture was plain and serviceable, the sort of pieces chosen for use rather than show. Mrs. Foster gestured to a chair near the hearth, and Miss Marple set the basket on the table, beginning to unpack it with the air of someone who expects the other person to speak in her own time. "They told me it was Emily," Mrs. Foster said after a moment, her hands flat on the tabletop. "That's what they said when Maggie Renshaw came by, though she only knew because someone shouted it in the lane." She sat heavily, as if the weight of the words had found her now that they were said aloud. Was it an accident?" Miss Marple's fingers smoothed the tea towel over the honey jar. "Dr. Haydock will know more presently. She was found in the meadow. There was a ring box on the church steps, not far from where people were gathering for service." Mrs. Foster's eyes flicked up, sharp. A ring box? Yes, with a gold ring set with a pale sapphire. I thought it might be known to you. There was a silence, brief, but with edges to it. Mrs. Foster's gaze dropped again to the table. Emily had no ring. Not from me, and not from... She stopped herself, biting down on the rest. She wasn't engaged. Not officially. Miss Marple poured tea into the waiting cups, her hands steady. Unofficial engagements can sometimes be as binding as official ones in the minds of those involved. Mrs. Foster gave a short, dry laugh. Emily wasn't a girl to bind herself easily. She had her father's way of holding back until she'd decided. He was like that. You could talk to him all day and not know whether he'd agreed with you or dismissed every word. It was a comfort sometimes, and a frustration other times. You must have been close. The woman's lips pressed together in a way that did not suggest agreement. Close enough to live under the same roof. But Emily, she shook her head. She kept her own counsel, worked her hours, brought home her pay, never asked me for more than the occasional postage stamp or a spoonful of sugar when she'd forgotten to buy it. She had friends, I suppose, that girl Elsie sometimes, and Thomas Reed. Miss Marple let the name hang just long enough. The young carpenter? Yes, he did some work on the hives last year, new stands for 2 of them, to keep the damp from rotting the base. Emily liked his company, that much I could tell, but she never said a word about promises or plans, and if she had a ring, she didn't show it here. They sipped in silence for a while. Miss Marple's eyes wandered over the room without appearing to. On the mantel stood a small ceramic dish shaped like a hive, its lid slightly askew. A faint whiff of lavender drifted from it. There was also, tucked half out of sight on a side table, a length of pale knitted wool, loosely looped as if it had been unrolled in haste. "Did Emily keep much jewellery?" Miss Marple asked casually. "Hardly any. A pair of small pearl studs that were her mother's. She wore those to services. And a silver chain she bought at a market. She wasn't one for trinkets." "And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "a ring box on the church steps, on a morning when all the village would be present. One wonders what it was meant to say, and to whom." Mrs. Foster's gaze snapped to hers, as if to measure the intention behind the remark. But before she could speak, a knock sounded at the door. Sharp, official. Mrs. Foster rose, wiping her hands on her apron. "That'll be the police." She opened the door to reveal Inspector Slack, his hat slightly askew and a notebook already in hand. "Mrs. Foster," he said, stepping just inside, "I'll need to ask you some questions about your stepdaughter. We've had reports of a connection between her and a Thomas Reed. You know anything about that?" "I know she spoke to him, yes. More than she spoke to most young men. But what they said wasn't my business, Inspector." Slack's pencil scratched. "When did you last see her?" "Yesterday evening. She'd been into the village, came back just before 8, said she was tired and went straight to her room. I didn't hear her go out again." Miss Marple set down her cup. "If she did go out later, perhaps it was to meet someone privately. The meadow is a very visible place, but also easy to leave without notice if one takes the hedge path." Slack gave her a look that might have been annoyance or acknowledgement. With him, the two were often close. "We'll see about that. Mrs. Foster, did Emily own a ring set with a pale sapphire?" "No. If she did, it wasn't here, and I'd have known." Slack jotted another note. "All right. We'll want to speak with Reed, and if you think of anything, anyone she might have been meeting, send word." When he had gone, Mrs. Foster lingered at the door, staring after him. "They'll dig until they find something," she said quietly. "Even if it isn't what's there." Miss Marple rose, tucking the tea towel back into the basket. "They'll find something because something is there. The question is whether it will be the right thing. And that," she added gently, is often down to the smallest details. Mrs. Foster said nothing, but her hand rested on the table where the length of pale knitted wool lay, her fingers curling over it as though to shield it from view. Outside, the hum of the hives followed Miss Marple down the path. She paused at the gate, her eyes taking in the garden once more. Near the side wall, a chair had been set beneath the shade of a climbing rose. Its back leg was freshly mended, the wood still pale where it had been planed smooth. She filed it away with the other small observations she had made that day, the thread of wool, the lavender scent, the gleam of a ring's clasp, each a quiet piece of something larger, waiting to be set in place. As she made her way back toward the village, she saw Thomas Reed before he saw her. He was coming along the lower path from the direction of the carpentry shed, a satchel slung over his shoulder. When he noticed her, he slowed, his expression a mix of politeness and wariness. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his cap. "Good morning, Mr. Reed. You've heard the sad news, I suppose?" His jaw tightened. "About Emily? Yes, I heard from a lad in the square. I was on my way to see Mrs. Foster." "I've just come from there," Miss Marple said. "She may have Inspector Slack with her now." His gaze shifted to the road, then back to her. "They'll want to ask about me. I expect they think—" He trailed off, then forced a thin smile. "Well, it won't be the first time folk have guessed wrong." Miss Marple's voice was mild. "Guessing wrong is a common pastime. But sometimes, Mr. Reed, it is the smallest truth, overlooked by everyone, that sets the matter right." He looked at her sharply then, as if trying to determine whether she knew something he did not want known. But he said nothing more, only nodded and continued toward the cottage. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind arranging and rearranging the morning's impressions. There was something here, a pattern, faint but definite, like the shadow of lace against a tablecloth. All it needed was the right angle of light. Miss Marple did not go directly home. The village was awake now in a way it had not been earlier, doors half open, curtains twitching, the low hum of conversation just behind them. She took the longer way round, skirting the green where a knot of women stood with their baskets, their heads bent together in that posture peculiar to the exchange of news, too recent to be written down. They glanced up as she passed, one or two offering a sympathetic smile, as though she too might be in need of consolation. Near the post office, she found Agnes Hartwell, standing on the step, the morning edition folded under one arm, though there would be no mention of Emily in it yet. Agnes greeted her with that particular brightness which often masks unease. "I hear you've been to see Mrs. Foster," Agnes said. "She didn't send you away. Then? Not everyone comes back from there looking as composed as you do." "She was kind enough to offer me a seat," Miss Marple replied. "We had tea, and we spoke of Emily." Agnes's expression sharpened. "Did she mention Thomas Reed? Because I've seen him come by her place of an evening. Not often, but enough to notice. And once, this was last month, he had something in his hand, a small box. Could have been anything, but I thought—" She glanced at Miss Marple's face as though to measure how much to continue. "Well, I thought it might be for Emily." Miss Marple's tone was mild. "A small box might hold a great many things." "Yes, but it was velvet. I could tell even from across the street. Velvet has a way of catching the light, you know, and it wasn't any colour you'd expect from tools or fittings." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And did you see Emily with it afterwards?" Agnes hesitated. "No, but then Emily was careful about such things. If it was meant for her, she wouldn't be showing it about the place." Miss Marple thanked her and went on. It was useful to know what people noticed in passing. More useful still to know what they inferred from it. Both could be correct, and both could be entirely wrong. But the reasons behind each observation were rarely without value. She crossed the green toward the tea room, thinking of Elsie Cranford. The girl was inside, wiping down a row of tables with a briskness that did not quite disguise her distraction. At the sight of Miss Marple, she set the cloth aside and came over, smoothing her apron. "Miss Marple, did you speak to Mrs. Foster?" "Yes, my dear. She is, understandably, distressed." Elsie's hands twisted together for a moment before she spoke. "Emily told me something last week. I wasn't sure if it mattered, but now. She said someone had been leaving her little things. Not money, exactly. More like tokens. A pressed flower left on her windowsill. A scrap of ribbon on the gatepost. And then—" Elsie hesitated, lowering her voice. "A note. Just a folded bit of paper in her hymn book. No name on it. It said, 'Sunday will be the day.'" Miss Marple's gaze softened, but did not waver. "Did she show you this note?" "No. She only told me about it when we were tidying up. She said she thought she knew who it was from. I asked if it was Thomas, but she didn't answer. Just smiled in that way she had, like she knew something you didn't." "And she kept the note?" "I think so. She didn't say she'd thrown it away. She kept it in her room, maybe, or in her bag." Miss Marple considered this. A ring box on the church steps, a note about Sunday, and a girl found in the meadow. It was beginning to form a shape, though one still blurred at the edges. Outside, the street seemed to lean toward the carpentry shed where Thomas Reed worked. The scent of fresh-cut wood drifted on the air as she approached. Through the open doorway, Thomas was at his bench, planing a length of oak, the shavings curling away in pale ribbons. He looked up when she stepped in. "Miss Marple, I've just come from Mrs. Foster." Inspector Slack had his say. "And what did you tell him?" "That Emily and I were friends, that I hadn't seen her since Friday afternoon, which is true." He set the plane aside, his expression taut. "We were supposed to talk yesterday evening, but she didn't come." "Talk about what?" He hesitated, then reached under the bench and brought out a small cloth bag. From it, he drew a velvet ring box, the twin, in size and colour, of the one Miss Marple carried in her cardigan pocket. He opened it to reveal not a ring, but a neatly coiled length of fine gold chain. "I made her a pendant setting for that sapphire," he said quietly. "It wasn't hers, not originally. It belonged to my grandmother. I'd had it reset. I meant to give it to her yesterday evening, but she didn't appear. I didn't leave it anywhere for her. Certainly not on the church steps." Miss Marple regarded the chain. Then the ring box that was found. Someone wanted it to be seen, and to be thought of as hers. "That's my worry," Thomas said grimly. "Someone's making it look like I gave her that ring. I never did." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "someone knew there was a sapphire in your possession." He looked startled. "I never told anyone except Emily, unless—" He stopped, his brow furrowing. "I suppose Mrs. Foster might have overheard. That day I was fitting the new hive stands. Emily and I were talking about it." Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was thinking of the lavender scent clinging to the ring box, the thread of pale wool, and the mended chair in Mrs. Foster's garden. Small things, each insignificant alone, but together beginning to point in a direction. Leaving the shed, she found herself considering the next step. There were still too many open spaces in the picture, too many gaps where motive might slip through. The note Elsie had mentioned needed finding, and if Emily had indeed kept it, it would be in her room at Old Post Cottage. The constable posted at the meadow was now stationed outside the cottage gate, his posture suggesting that guarding was a less interesting occupation than imagined. Miss Marple greeted him, explaining that she had promised Mrs. Foster she would bring over the honey jar. The man, more obliging than suspicious, allowed her through. Inside, the air held the faint scent of beeswax polish, but beneath it lingered something else. Lavender again, sharper now and more insistent. Emily's room was small, its single window looking out toward the hives. On the dressing table stood a vase with a single sprig of dried lavender, its colour faded but still aromatic. Miss Marple's eye was drawn to a hymn book lying beside it. She opened it carefully, turning the pages, until, halfway through, she found a slip of paper folded twice. She eased it open. The writing was neat, but without flourish. The message simple. Sunday will be the day. No name, no signature. But the ink was faintly smudged at the corner, as if a hand not entirely steady had folded it in haste. She replaced the note exactly as she had found it, closing the hymn book and setting it back in its place. Some things were better left undisturbed until the right moment. As she stepped out into the garden again, the hum of the bees rose and fell like a quiet conversation. Miss Marple paused by the chair under the rose, running her hand lightly along the mended leg. The new wood was smooth, but just above the join, there was a faint streak of something darker. Sap, perhaps, or resin. She rubbed it between finger and thumb. Sticky, with the faintest scent of lavender oil. It was not a great leap to imagine how such a mark might come to be there, nor to see in it the outline of an act performed not for the sake of furniture, but for something, or someone, altogether different. When she left, she walked slowly, her mind fitting together the scraps. A ring box displayed where all could see. A note promising a day, lavender where lavender should not be, and a thread of wool that did not belong to the meadow. It was not yet a complete tapestry, but the pattern was emerging, and it was one she recognized from other places, other times, where the truth lay not in what was shouted, but in what was quietly left to be found. Miss Marple returned home in the early afternoon, the note's simple words lingering in her mind like a faintly remembered refrain. She set the honey jar on the kitchen shelf, boiled water for tea, and sat for a moment at her table, looking at the velvet ring box she had kept in her pocket since morning. She had not opened it again since leaving the church. There was no need. The image of the pale sapphire and its slightly faded satin bed was fixed in her memory, along with the subtle lavender green scent clinging to it. The pattern was beginning to take on more distinct lines. Someone had wanted that ring and the box to be seen in public on the very morning Emily was found. It had been no careless loss. No private memento slipped unnoticed from a pocket. It had been staged. And staged acts, Miss Marple knew, always carried intention. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door, 2 short raps, followed by a pause, then one more. She rose and found Reverend Cole standing on her step, hat in hand, looking rather as though he'd forgotten the words of a sermon, midway through delivery. "I won't keep you long, Miss Marple," he began. "It's just, I was at the vicarage going over the vestry records, and I thought perhaps you should know something. Emily came to see me on Thursday afternoon." Miss Marple motioned him inside, setting another cup and saucer on the table. "What was the nature of her visit?" "She said she wanted to make a private inquiry about marriage bans." He paused, watching her expression. "Not to have them called, mind you, just to know how soon they could be, if she wished. She didn't say who the gentleman was, only that she wanted to be sure no one else could object." Miss Marple stirred the tea. "And did you tell her?" "Yes. I explained the process. She listened, thanked me, and left. She seemed thoughtful, not exactly happy. I assumed she'd made up her mind about something." "Now," he sighed, the sound heavy with unspoken concern. "I expect the police will want to know, but perhaps you can consider it in your way first." After he left, Miss Marple sat a while longer, her mind layering this new piece atop the others. Emily had been contemplating marriage, or at least the option of securing it swiftly, and she had wanted no objections. That suggested someone whose position might be precarious in the eyes of others. It could be Thomas Reed, certainly, but it could also be someone altogether less expected. By mid-afternoon, the sound of boots on the lane announced Inspector Slack. He entered without lingering at the threshold, his manner brisk and faintly irritable. "We've spoken to Reed. Says he didn't give her the ring, claims he was working here in the village yesterday afternoon. 2 people confirmed seeing him, so he's not out of the picture, but he's not looking like the obvious villain." "Obvious villains seldom are," Miss Marple remarked. Slack gave her a narrow look. "We've also been to Old Post Cottage. Mrs. Foster's not pleased with us poking about, but we found nothing much. Clothes, books, the usual. No note, though. I thought you might have seen something." Miss Marple regarded him with polite blandness. "If I had, Inspector, I should be sure to tell you when the moment was right. Sometimes things need to be kept in their place until they're ready to be understood." He muttered something about amateur detectives, but let it pass. "We'll talk to that friend of hers, the Cranford girl, see if she knows more. And the vicar says Emily was asking about marriage bans. That opens a new line, doesn't it?" "It does," Miss Marple agreed. "Especially if the intended groom was not the one everyone assumes." Slack frowned. "Meaning Reed might not be the man. Then who?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. People have their private reasons for secrecy. Sometimes it is affection. Sometimes it is money. Sometimes it is something far more dangerous to mention. When Slack had gone, she took her cardigan and hat, deciding that another visit to the meadow would not be wasted. The constable on duty there had grown bored enough to greet her warmly. The flattened grass where Emily had lain was still visible, though someone had draped a sheet over the spot, perhaps in some attempt at decency. Miss Marple walked the perimeter, her gaze tracing the hedge line. She found the narrow gap she had noticed earlier, a place where the hawthorn was thinner, with broken twigs at about knee height. On the ground lay a small, frayed scrap of pale wool, caught on a thorn. She held it beside the piece she had taken from the lich gate that morning. The weave was identical. Following the hedge path, she emerged onto a side track that led toward the back of Mrs. Foster's garden. It was not a long walk, and it could be taken unseen from the main road. Standing there, she could see the chair under the rose, the mended leg catching the light. The air was still enough that she heard the creak of the gate behind her. Mrs. Foster appeared, carrying a shallow box lined with cloth. Inside, neatly capped jars of honey glowed amber in the late light. "Selling to the shop," she said by way of explanation. "It's a good week for the bees." Miss Marple stepped aside to let her pass. "I trust you'll have no trouble finding a buyer." Mrs. Foster gave a short laugh. "Not with honey. People always want sweetness, even if they don't know what's gone into it." As she walked away, Miss Marple's eyes followed her, noting the way her skirt hem brushed against the mended chair before she left the garden. There was something there. Something just out of reach, like a word hovering at the edge of recall. On her way back to the lane, she encountered Agnes Hartwell again, now with a string bag over her arm. "They're saying Emily might have had secrets," Agnes said without preamble. "I told them, secrets don't come alone. They bring trouble with them. I wouldn't be surprised if it was over some man who wasn't hers to have." Miss Marple merely inclined her head. People would talk, and some of them would even be right. But it was not their accuracy that interested her. It was the tone, the mixture of relish and foreboding, which revealed far more than the content of the words. When she reached her cottage again, she set the scrap of wool beside the first and took out the ring box once more. The scent was fading now, but the memory of it remained vivid, lavender, with that green, sharp undertone. She had smelled it in Mrs. Foster's front room, and again clinging to the mended chair. It would soon be time to bring these small facts together, before Slack charged ahead with the wrong conclusion. But there was one more visit she intended to make first, quietly, without announcement. She needed to be certain about the source of that lavender scent, and about whether Emily had ever truly worn the ring that everyone was so eager to attach to her name. For answers to those questions, Miss Marple thought it was best to speak to someone who noticed the smallest details without being asked to, and in St. Mary Mead, that meant the village dressmaker. Miss Marple found Mrs. Penhaligon at her machine with the window propped open on 2 wooden cotton reels, the needle ticking in a neat domestic rhythm that sounded somehow more dependable than bells or clocks. The little shop smelled of steam, chalk, and pressed cambric. A ladder of sunlight fell across the counter, turning the glass jar of buttons into tiny moons. "Miss Marple," said Mrs. Penhaligon, lifting her foot from the treadle. "You're out early for a Monday. You've heard, of course. Poor girl. Poor Mrs. Foster." Yes, Miss Marple said. And since I am not much good with hems, I thought I might be useful in the other way, by asking you to tell me what you have noticed. You see, you notice things without thinking it an achievement. She put the compliment down like a coin and did not fuss with it. The dressmaker's mouth softened. Well, it's not noticing exactly. One just has to get things right or people will say one's work is sloppy. Do sit, Miss Marple. The chair is steady. Mr. Reed fixed that back strut for me last month. She patted the chair with a certain proprietorial pride. A good hand, that boy. Clean joins. Miss Marple sat. You've had Mrs. Foster in recently? Twice these past 3 weeks. First for an alteration to a plain day dress. The waist let out a whisper. Nothing to see if you weren't looking. Then for a little repair on a summer cardigan. Loose knit, pale as milk. Caught on a latch, she said. Right at the hip. I grafted the stitch back in. You have to do it with a fine hook or it looks like a scar. She went to a drawer, and because making things visible is a sort of proof, held up a sliver of pale wool from her oddments. I keep the trimmings in case they want me to darn again. Miss Marple turned the scrap in her fingers. The thread lay against her own piece from the lich-gate, like a sister to a sister. And lavender? She asked, as if it were a topic like weather. Mrs. Penhaligon laughed softly. Oh, that woman and her lavender. She keeps sachets in the sleeves of everything when she brings it. I don't mind the smell, but it gets into the steam, and then you're scenting all your customers like Sunday drawers. She likes it a shade green, not sweet exactly. She said she tucks a dab of oil into her polish for the furniture. Helps with beeswax. I suppose it does. Do you recall Emily bringing you anything? Mrs. Penhaligon paused. Emily? Once or twice, not for finery. She had me shorten a skirt the week before Whitsun, sensible length, not to make a show of herself. And, oh yes, last Thursday she came in with a jacket from the second-hand rail at Kersey's. Light navy, decent cloth, sleeves too long by 1.5 inches. She asked if I could turn them up quick. I said I could if she didn't mind a plain hem. She smiled, the kind that makes you think of a girl who has decided something, and said plain would do. The dressmaker glanced at the clock. She was to collect it Saturday afternoon, but she didn't come. A jacket, Miss Marple repeated, hearing again. Reverend Coles's quiet voice about bands. And Mr. Pettigrew, he is careful about his cuffs. He is careful about everything, said Mrs. Penhaligon, without malice. Had me taking a cassock last month as if it were a gentleman's dinner coat. He brought in a box too to ask if I had a ribbon he could use for the Mother's Guild sale. Lavender sateen to tie round it. A ring box, velvet, a bit scuffed. It belonged to something someone had donated without the pendant it once held. He said a pretty box would fetch a coin even without a treasure. She gave a small sniff. People who valued workmanship had a way of finding sentiment wasteful if it would not pay. I trimmed it with a narrow bow and a dab of starch to make the tails sit properly. Miss Marple's mind placed the bright clasp, the rubbed velvet, the little breath of lavender that did not come from drawers alone. And who bought the box? I couldn't say. I sent it along with the Reverend's wife when she came for the rest. It would have been at the church hall the Friday before the fete. People pick up such things with a sigh and don't give their names. It makes them feel thrifty and indulgent in the same breath. Miss Marple thanked her and rose. On the counter, a small saucer of pins had caught a thread of pale wool. She freed it absently, as if to pay with order for the order she had been given. At the door, Mrs. Penhaligon called after her. If it helps, Thomas Reed asked me last week whether a chain sits better from a collarbone or a throat. I told him on a girl with Emily's shape it would be prettier at the hollow, where the light catches. He turned red as a beet. She smiled. Practical women are often tender-hearted in their talk of earnest boys. It was a short walk from pins to sawdust. As Miss Marple stepped into the lane, a commotion rolled up from the direction of the carpentry shed. A shout, the clatter of wood, the dull slap of boots. She quickened her step in that way she had of seeming not to hurry. Two boys were outside the shed, faces alight with the excitement of being handy to Calamity. The smaller pointed. "Miss, someone's smashed Mr. Reed's window, glass all over. Inspector says there's been a robbery." The words shone in his mouth. Inside, the little workshop looked as though a careless wind had gone through it. The small glazing pane above the bench was cracked in a spider's web. On the floor beneath, sparkling shards lay among curls of pale shavings. Inspector Slack was there, one hand on his hip, the other hovering over a drawer that hung open like a tongue. Thomas stood, rigid, the cloth bag open on the bench. It was empty. "It's gone," he said flatly when he saw Miss Marple. "The setting and the stone. I swear to you, I locked the drawer last night. I went to look just now, thinking if the police would be at me, I should best bring it to them to keep. And it's gone." Slack turned. Window, forced, latch broken, drawer jimmied. Anyone would say that's a thief who knows what he came for. "Or someone who knows exactly what we will say," Miss Marple murmured. She squatted. Not an easy thing at her age, but she did it as if there were nothing remarkable in the movement, and looked at the glass. The finest splinters lay in the trough of the sash. A few glittered on the inside sill. On the ground outside the shed, visible through the broken pane, the soil was scarcely marked. "Will you mind the soles of your shoes a moment, Inspector?" she said politely. "If one broke the window from outside, one leaves more glass on the floor than on the sill, and if one reached in to unlatch, one leaves scuffs in the bed there. But there is more glass on the outside ledge than one would expect. And look." She touched with a knitting needle she had conjured from her bag, because Miss Marple was one of those women for whom a small tool appears as if intended for the moment. "The latch isn't splintered. It's been unscrewed. See, clean as you please, the circle round the screw where the paint is bare. One unscrews from within." Slack grunted. "You're saying it's staged." "I am saying," Miss Marple said gently, "that anyone who wished us to think an intruder came could have done a more convincing job by actually coming in." Thomas stared. "But I didn't." He stopped himself, colour rising to his cheekbones. "Inspector, I didn't take it, and I didn't fake a burglary. But there's folks who'd like it to look that way." Slack's pencil found its way to the notebook of its own will. "Such as?" Thomas's mouth tightened. "Ask Mrs. Foster who she doesn't want for a son-in-law." "Ask yourself," Miss Marple said mildly, "who wants to stir you into temper where it can be written down." It had the intended effect. The boy breathed, looked down at his hands, unclenched them. Slack, who disliked melodrama unless it resulted in a confession, closed the notebook. "We'll dust the drawer," he said, meaning that someone else would, and told the constable to keep gawkers off the threshold. He left without dismissing Miss Marple because he had yet to learn how one dismissed weather. When the inspector was gone, Thomas sank on the stool and put his head in his hands for one measured breath. Then he raised it. "Miss Marple, whoever did this had a key, or they knew where I kept mine. I hide it on that nail under the bench." His face clouded. "Emily knew. I told her where it was one day, when I asked her to take the parcel from the post if I was out. But she wouldn't. She wouldn't. Shall we suppose," Miss Marple said, "that she did not? And suppose, too, that someone else knew not because you told them, but because they watched. One learns a great deal by watching." She stood. "Lock the door now, if you please. And if you have a second key, put it somewhere even. You would not think sensible." She stepped back into the lane and found Agnes Hartwell materializing as if from a hedge. Agnes was pink with news. "Miss Marple, they say Mr. Reed's been burgled." "Well, it stands to reason, doesn't it? First the ring box, then the girl, now the boy's workshop. These things come in threes, my aunt always said. And I saw, mark me, I saw Mr. Pettigrew going by the vicarage not half an hour ago with a parcel under his arm tied with lavender ribbon." "Lavender," she emphasized, as if the plant were evidence in itself. "Mr. Pettigrew is a verger," Miss Marple said with equal emphasis. "Vergers' errands are frequently wrapped up with ribbons from parish cupboards." But the picture moved a degree in her head. A parish box, with a ribbon bow, a verger who had startled at sight of velvet on a step, a woman whose cardigans smelled of green lavender and whose chairs bore resin with the same, a note that said Sunday would be the day, a jacket to be hurriedly altered, bands asked about without a name. Before she turned toward the vicarage, she went first, because her order of small things had a reason, to the back of Old Post Cottage again. Mrs. Foster was not in the garden. The chair under the rose stood prim as a cat. Upon its seat, a smear of something had dried to a faint sheen. Miss Marple touched it with the tip of her finger and brought it to her nose. Not sap. Propolis softened with oil. Lavender, again that green thread under the floral. The stuff is used on minor cuts. Beekeepers swear by it for hands rasped by frames and nettles. It would make a good, inexpensive polish for a brass clasp as well, if one liked things to shine. At the vicarage gate, she met Pettigrew himself, coming out with the solemn bustle of a man whose duties are a proof against chaos. The parcel Agnes had seen was no longer under his arm. His hands were free, folded, composed. He started when he saw Miss Marple, a little jump under a carefully aligned smile. "Miss Marple," he said, "a trying day." "One grows used to trying days," she said. "They try, we resist." He inclined his head. "I trust you are not one to give in to gossip." "I try not to give in to anything," she returned. "Mr. Pettigrew, you recognized that ring box this morning. You thought it was something you had seen before." His mouth worked. Then he sighed. "We had one at the Mothers' Guild sale. Mrs. Penhaligon prettied it up. I ought not to have reacted at the steps, but it looked like the same. It was familiar." He hesitated. "I took the leftover things back to the vestry Friday night, to store until the autumn jumble. The box was among them. When I went in on Saturday to straighten, I couldn't find it. I assumed Mrs. Coles had taken it to give away." "And did she?" "She says not." He met Miss Marple's eyes for the first time fully. "So you see, Miss Marple, I had a private alarm this morning when Agnes opened that box. I thought, how odd that a trifle from our cupboard should appear on the church steps with a ring inside it." "Odd," Miss Marple agreed, "and instructive. It tells us the murderer is as domestic as a parish list, knows our halls, our cupboards, our drawers. They did not buy their theatre from a shop. They borrowed it from the vestry." Pettigrew blanched. "Murderer, Miss Marple." She did not soften the word. It would be a hard fall indeed to lay a girl down that neatly, with no grass broken where it ought to be. "It is murder, Mr. Pettigrew, and a tidy one at that." He swallowed. "Then I'm doubly at fault for not speaking at once. I thought you would see without me adding to the tumult. And perhaps I was protecting the parish from scandal. Foolish." "Not foolish," Miss Marple said, smiling a little. "Merely human. We often put a ribbon on what we do not wish to see." She laid a hand like a petal on his sleeve. "Tell Inspector Slack about the box and the vestry. Today, he does not enjoy being told, but he does like to have been told." When he had gone, she stood in the quiet and allowed her mind to hold all the pieces at once. Emily's quiet smile over a plain hem turned quick. The banns asked for without a name. The note promising Sunday. The ring box that had slept in a parish cupboard until stolen. The lavender that threaded from Mrs. Foster's sleeves to the church steps and into the resin on a chair. The staged burglary and its neat, unscrewed latch. The verger's startlement. She thought also of Louisa Price's blade shoes skating briefly through the village last spring, and dismissed her, not out of hand, but like one sets aside a pattern that does not match the stitch. There was one thing left to do before the evening folded up the day. Miss Marple walked to the telephone box by the green and, with the calm of someone ordering milk, rang the vicarage, the tea room, and Mrs. Foster's cottage in turn. She conveyed, with small variations suited to each ear, that certain belongings of Emily's had been found and would be sorted in the church hall after evensong. Left unnamed. A note, a ribbon, a little trinket. "It will spare upset later," she said mildly, "if those who knew her best might come by." People who are innocent of stratagems take these phrases as kindness. People who are not cannot resist them. At home, she laid the 2 scraps of wool together in a saucer and set the ring box beside them. Evening rain ticked briefly at the window, then passed on. She poured herself a cup, not because tea would add to her understanding, but because tea is what one drinks while waiting for people to show themselves. The evening light faded to that particular mellow grey, which always made the high street lamps appear reluctant to wake. Miss Marple sat by her parlour window, teacup in hand, watching the damp sheen on the cobbles. She had set the saucer with the 2 scraps of pale wool on the table beside her, the ring box neatly placed just beyond them. Their smallness belied their weight. At 6:30, the bells of St. Clement's sounded for evensong. She rose, adjusted her hat, and made her way toward the church hall. The air was cool after the brief shower, scented with turned earth and chimney smoke. Through the open door of the hall, she saw Reverend Coles setting out a tray of cups, his wife fussing over plates of biscuits, as if the presence of tea could explain away the day's ugliness. Inside, the room was lit by 2 overhead lamps, their light falling on a trestle table at the far end. Upon it lay a small assortment of items, each chosen by Miss Marple with care. There was a folded cardigan, pale wool, loosely knitted, the hymn book from Emily's dressing table, a pressed sprig of lavender on a dish, and a little parcel wrapped in brown paper with no label. She had made no mention of a ring box. She wanted the right eyes to seek it without prompting. The first to arrive was Mrs. Foster. She came briskly, her shoes leaving faint damp prints on the linoleum, and offered no greeting beyond a nod. Her eyes moved at once to the table, settling on the cardigan. She touched it briefly, her hand lingering at the repaired stitch near the hem. "That's Emily's," she said, her voice flat. "I'd thank you to give it over." "Of course," Miss Marple replied mildly, but made no move to hand it across. "Perhaps we should see if anyone else recognizes it." Mrs. Foster's gaze sharpened, but she stepped back as others began to arrive. Agnes Hartwell in a storm of curiosity, Elsie Cranford looking pale but resolute, Mr. Pettigrew with his familiar air of solemnity, and finally Thomas Reed, his eyes flicking from face to face before settling on Miss Marple with something like wary hope. Reverend Coles began in his gentle, fumbling way to thank them for coming, speaking of community and the importance of ensuring Emily's belongings were returned to those who had the right to them. As he spoke, Miss Marple moved to the table and, with apparent absent-mindedness, adjusted the lavender sprig so that it lay closer to the hymn book. Agnes was the first to speak when the Reverend paused. "That cardigan," she said, leaning in. "I've seen Mrs. Foster in one just like it." Mrs. Foster's head snapped round. "I have more than one cardigan, Agnes. I keep my things tidy." "Indeed you do," Miss Marple murmured, "and lavender keeps them tidy smelling. Even this little sprig has the same scent as the clasp of the ring box found on the church steps." For a moment, silence held the room, broken only by the faint rattle of cups as Mrs. Coles shifted the tray. Mrs. Foster drew herself up. "I know nothing about any ring box." Thomas's voice, low but tight, cut through. "You knew about my key. If you wanted to take something from my workshop, I wouldn't waste my time on your trinkets," she shot back, colour rising in her cheeks. Miss Marple's tone was calm, almost conversational. "And yet, the staged burglary at your late stepdaughter's friend's workshop was executed by someone who knew the latch could be unscrewed from inside, just as the ring box was placed where it would draw every eye in the village, and just as Emily's body was laid in the meadow with care, without the scuff or muddle of a real struggle." All eyes turned to her now. She went on, her words unhurried, each finding its mark. "The cardigan is yours, Mrs. Foster. I took a thread from it myself this morning, caught on the chair under the rose bush. Another piece was left on the lich gate, where the ring box was placed. The lavender scent on the box matches your household oil and wax polish. The clasp was polished recently, perhaps on Saturday evening. Mrs. Foster's mouth opened, but no words came. Her hands gripped the back of a chair. You wish to prevent a marriage, Miss Marple continued softly. Emily had asked Reverend Coles about banns. She meant to secure her choice before anyone could object. You feared that meant Thomas, and you disliked the match. Whether it was him or another man, you preferred no match at all. The note in her hymn book, Sunday will be the day, was left as a lure. She went to meet someone she trusted. You took the ring box from the vestry, added the ring, perhaps a family piece you kept, and laid it on the steps, knowing it would set tongues wagging and point to Thomas. Then you met her in the meadow. Mrs. Foster found her voice at last, brittle but steady. You have no proof. The proof, Miss Marple said gently, is in the small things no one else would think to notice. The wool, the lavender, the polish on the clasp. The path from the meadow leads straight to your garden gate. And there is propolis mixed with lavender oil on the mended leg of that rose chair, the same mix beekeepers use for minor cuts. I found it this afternoon. Elsie made a soft, shocked sound. Agnes looked almost triumphant, as though the unmasking of anyone in the village, whatever the crime, confirmed her own worldliness. Pettigrew cleared his throat. Inspector Slack should hear this. He will, Miss Marple said. I have already asked him to come presently. I thought it kinder that the truth be spoken here first, where there are friendly faces, even if they are also honest ones. There was a scraping of boots at the door. Slack entered, his gaze sweeping the room. I've had word there's talk of a confession. No confession, Miss Marple said, but an explanation. One you will find fits the evidence you have, if you place the right weight on the smallest details. Slack listened, frowning as she repeated her account, this time with the brevity that comes of knowing the right points to emphasize. When she finished, he looked at Mrs. Foster. Well? Mrs. Foster's shoulders slumped. I only meant to frighten her, to make her break it off, whoever it was. She was so sure she knew best. I never meant... She broke off, her face drawn. We argued. She turned to walk away and tripped. The ground was wet. She struck her head on the stone by the hedge. I thought, if it looked like Reed, if the ring was found. You thought it would be simpler to direct suspicion, Miss Marple finished quietly. And so you tidied her where she lay and made your scene for the morning. Mrs. Foster nodded once, her gaze fixed on the floor. Slack gave a curt order to the constable waiting outside. As they led her away, the murmurs began, low and disbelieving. Miss Marple touched Elsie's arm. Go home, my dear. Remember Emily as she was with you, the girl who lent a book and waited for it back, who listened more than she spoke. Those are the things worth keeping. When the hall had emptied, Miss Marple replaced the cardigan in the paper parcel, folded the lavender sprig back into the hymn book, and slipped the ring box into her pocket. The grey light outside had deepened to true evening. The lamps now shone without reluctance, casting warm circles on the damp pavement. She walked home slowly, the air cool against her face, thinking not of the drama just past, but of the curious truth that it is often the quietest, tidiest people who can stir the deepest trouble, especially when they believe they are acting for someone's good. The following morning dawned pale and still, as if the village itself were holding its breath after the events of the night before. Miss Marple, sitting at her small kitchen table, watched the steam curl from her teacup and let her mind wander over the pieces of the affair. Not just the solution, which was settled now, but the lingering edges that always remained after such things. Justice, she had found, did not wipe a place clean. It merely rearranged the dust. Outside, the lane was quieter than usual. Even Agnes Hartwell's door remained closed, though Miss Marple could picture her within, writing letters to distant cousins with the restrained drama of someone who has been both eyewitness and commentator. She suspected that before the week was out, the entire county would know of the lavender-polished clasp and the cardigan thread. There came a gentle knock at the door, so gentle it might almost have been the breeze. She opened it to find Elsie Cranford standing there, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her hands twisting the handle of a small paper bag. "I thought," Elsie began, then stopped. "I thought you might like to have this. It was Emily's. She left it with me last week, said she didn't want it in her room just then. I didn't understand why, but now—" She held out the bag. Inside was a tiny notebook bound in faded blue cloth. Miss Marple carried it to the table, motioning Elsie to sit. The pages were filled in a neat, deliberate hand. Lists of things Emily had spent or saved, small sketches of flowers, and here and there a phrase or name. Near the middle, Miss Marple found an entry that made her pause. "Ring to be left on steps. Will she notice? If not, then he will." She glanced at Elsie. Did Emily say who she was? Elsie shook her head. "No, I thought it was just her way of jotting things she saw. She liked watching people." She hesitated. "Do you think she knew what Mrs. Foster meant to do?" Miss Marple closed the notebook. "I think she suspected something might happen, though not this. People often believe they can control how far an unkindness will go. They are usually mistaken." Elsie's fingers tightened around her apron. "It feels wrong, even with Mrs. Foster taken away. Like there's a hollow in the village now, and it's not just because Emily's gone." "That feeling," Miss Marple said gently, "is the echo of what we cannot put quite right. Time will soften it, but one must be patient." After Elsie left, Miss Marple slipped the notebook into the top drawer of her writing desk. Some things were better kept where only the careful would find them. Then she put on her hat and stepped into the street. She had promised to call on Reverend Coles, who wished to speak about arrangements for Emily's burial. The vicar received her in his study, the air thick with the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. He looked more composed than he had in days, though his eyes held a shadow. "Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you, not only for solving the matter, but for the way you did it. You spared us a spectacle in the churchyard." "It seemed kinder," she replied. "The truth, when it comes, need not always be flung like a stone." He nodded. "We shall hold a small service. Quiet. I've spoken with Thomas Reed. He wishes to pay for the flowers. I think it's his way of putting something right." As she left the vicarage, she saw Thomas himself across the green, speaking with the constable. He caught her eye and crossed over, the set of his shoulders less defensive than before. "I wanted to tell you," he said, "that I've decided to leave for a bit. There's work in Dorchester for a man with my skills. Too many people here will still look at me and think—" He shrugged. "Sometimes a little distance is wise," Miss Marple said. "But don't be gone too long. Places change when you leave them unattended." He smiled faintly at that, tipped his cap, and walked on toward the lane. By midday, the clouds had thickened, promising more rain. Miss Marple returned home and lit the small fire in her grate. She had begun to think the matter closed when a knock, this time brisk and official, brought her to the door again. Inspector Slack stood there, his expression a curious mix of satisfaction and unease. "Thought you'd like to know, Miss Marple," he began without preamble. "We went through Mrs. Foster's things this morning, found a box tucked at the back of her wardrobe. Inside, another note. Same hand as the one in Emily's hymn book. This one said, 'If you won't listen, I'll make them see.'" Miss Marple took this in without surprise. Then Emily meant to force the matter into the open. "Looks that way," Slack agreed. "She might have been planning to put the ring on the steps herself, make it seem like an engagement, stir up talk. Mrs. Foster got wind of it and, well, you know the rest." "It would explain why she agreed to meet in the meadow," Miss Marple said. "She thought she was closing the trap herself, not stepping into another's." Slack glanced past her into the cosy order of the parlour. "Funny thing, how these quiet villages can turn, but I suppose you'd say it's human nature." "I would," Miss Marple said. "It's not the place, Inspector, it's the people. and they are the same everywhere, given the right or wrong conditions. He gave a grunt that might have been agreement and took his leave. When the door closed, Miss Marple stood for a long moment in the stillness. She thought of Emily's quick, private smile, of the cardigan thread clinging to the lich-gate, of lavender worked into polish, of the faint, oily sheen on the mended chair. None of it had been grand or dramatic, just the sort of overlooked detail that told the whole story when someone cared to see. That evening, she walked to the edge of the meadow. The grass had been disturbed again by the constables, but already nature was beginning to settle it, bent stalks lifting, trampled patches softening at the edges. The hawthorn hedge stood unchanged, its thorns catching the low sun. Miss Marple reached out and plucked a small twig, the end still marked where a thread had once caught. She carried it home in her pocket, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Cases closed in the eyes of the law could remain open in quieter ways, in the shifts of how neighbours spoke to each other, in the hesitations before greetings, in the silences that fell when certain names were mentioned. The truth might be known, but its shadow lingered. In her parlour, she placed the twig alongside the scraps of wool and the empty ring box. Then she poured herself a final cup of tea and settled into her chair, listening to the faint tick of the clock. Beyond her window, the lamps blinked on again, and the village resumed its slow, unhurried breathing, as if nothing had happened at all. But Miss Marple knew better, and she also knew that, in time, something else would come along to stir the dust once more. Morning yielded, as it always did, to the hum of small purposes. Even with the village under its thin film of shock, washing still went out, a cat still threaded a wall, and the baker's van still rattled its trays. Miss Marple welcomed such sounds the way one welcomes breathing after a fright. They steadied the mind and let the day consent to itself. She spent an hour with her mending basket, a practical occupation that often made room for thoughts to show their true shapes, and then put on her hat. There was one corner of the business that did not quite lie flat. It was not the large matter, which was in the hands of the law, but the small matter that had been made to look large, the theft at Thomas Reed's shed. She walked first to the church, where the nave smelled of flowers and cold stone, and the vestry held the odours of old polish and linen chests. Mr. Pettigrew was there as she expected, folding surplices with that grave economy suited to cloth that must not be scalded by creases. "You find me in my kingdom," he said, attempting a smile. "We are to be as decent as we can be for the service tomorrow." "Decency makes a very good habit," Miss Marple said. "It does not always make a good alibi." He glanced up, then away. "You think me remiss for not speaking about the box at once? I have told Inspector Slack." "I am glad," Miss Marple replied. "There is another little thing I wonder if you might help me with. You locked the vestry, of course." "Of course. And the church hall, where the Mothers' Guild stored their unsold items on Friday night. The same key serves both doors. It lives on its nail where I can put my hand on it in the dark." "In the dark," Miss Marple repeated, as if the phrase were merely pretty. "And do others know where your hand goes?" He coloured. "One hopes not. But I suppose it is possible someone watched. People think the vestry is a cupboard. It is not." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "It is a cupboard in which people place their best version of themselves." She let the remark rest, then asked, as if it were a domestic curiosity, "Have you had any reason, in the last day or two, to open the alms box?" "Why would I—" He stopped. Something in his face shifted. The tidy expression went slack for an instant, then refitted itself. "No," he said too carefully. "No, I have not." "Then we shall leave it," said Miss Marple, which is what she always said, just before she did not. She bade him good morning and crossed the aisle to the little wooden box with its narrow slot and its honest, undramatic brass hasp. It had, she knew, a second lock that admitted a thin-bladed key she had been given to hold one winter when the vicar and Mr. Pettigrew were both laid up with the same cough. She had put that key in her sewing case, People rarely think to look under thimbles for anything more consequential than a darning needle. She did not open it at once. Instead, she went to the south door and stood a moment, her hand on the latch, listening for footsteps. When none came, she returned, took the key from the little purse she kept in her sleeve pocket, and turned it in the lock. The lid lifted with a quiet domestic sound, like a bread tin. Inside lay a handful of coins, a folded parish notice, and at the bottom, pressed into the corner as neatly as a drawer sock, the fine gold chain, coiled in its nature and held together by a small twist of lavender-coloured thread. Miss Marple did not exclaim. She never did. She looked at it for a long second, then closed the lid again, turned the key and slipped it back into her purse. The chain she left where it lay. It would do better to be found by its proper finder. In the porch, she met Agnes, who had materialized like a thought one had forgotten one had invited. "I came to see the flowers," Agnes said, as if people often came to admire flowers on a weekday. "Mrs. Coles has put in lilies." I said roses would be warmer. "Roses are particular," Miss Marple said. "Lilies are more forgiving." She did not mind Agnes. Agnes was like weather, intrusive, changeable, and occasionally useful. "Did you know, Agnes dear, that the alms box is heavier today than yesterday?" Agnes's eyes popped with the polite greed of a mind that liked to shake a thing for the rattle. "Oh, has someone given generously?" "I think someone has returned something rather than given it," Miss Marple said. "And I think it would be a good deed if you were to fetch Reverend Coles, quietly, and ask him to look, and then to send for Inspector Slack. Quietly, Agnes." Agnes, who could be quiet when quiet meant being in the room where other people were being told things, sailed off with the solemnity of a deputized conscience. Miss Marple stayed in the cool nave and traced with her finger the groove time had worn at the end of one pew. Thumbs had rested there. Men had counted their prayers or their grievances. Women had measured out their patience. When the vicar and Inspector Slack arrived, one anxious, one annoyed, both dutiful, she stepped aside and let them open the box. Slack's exclamation, though brief, was deeply satisfied. "Well, well," he said, lifting the coil with his pencil. "It seems our thief has a scruple after all. Or a fright. Either way, Mr. Reed gets his chain back, and I get to write a report that does not end in a muddle." He glanced at Miss Marple. "You'll have an explanation bottled and labelled, I expect." "I have a supposition," Miss Marple said, which is what she said when she was certain. The person who meant the burglary to cast a shadow on Thomas discovered that the chain, not the ring, would do it, and took it for the purpose. But people sometimes discover that spoiling is untidy. The alms box is a very human compromise between guilt and returning things to the right hands without climbing too many fences. "You think Mrs. Foster crept back in the night?" Slack asked. "No," Miss Marple said. "Mrs. Foster is presently under conditions that allow for very little creeping, and she would not have chosen the alms box. It advertises repentance. She would have thrown it in a ditch and told herself the ditch was clean. Enough for a chain." She turned to the vicar. "Mr. Pettigrew has a key. He is fastidious, and he understands symbols. He would not like the idea of an unblessed object sitting in a drawer, nor the thought of it in a policeman's hand. He would put it in a place where it could be discovered under the heading of forgiveness, and his conscience could proofread his conduct in a nicer font." Slack's mouth twitched. The image pleased him in spite of himself. "You mean he meddled, again?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, "that he saw a thing out of place and attempted to put it where he thought it would make the least noise coming back. He meant well in the tidy way people mean well when they are afraid untidiness will show under their care." Slack went off to find Pettigrew. The vicar sat down heavily in a pew and took off his glasses, looking at them as if the glass might mend more than eyesight. "I thought we had done with the odd angles," he said. "Most furniture has one leg a little shorter than the others," Miss Marple replied. "It is why people keep slips of folded card in drawers." She touched his sleeve lightly. "Tell Mr. Reed yourself. It will do him good to have a kindness that is not wrapped in questions." By afternoon the news had gone out, not with a fanfare, but in that subdued ripple of relief a place feels when something misplaced finds its way home. Thomas, fetched from the yard behind the carpentry shed, stood very still when the vicar placed the chain in his palm. "I thought it was gone," he said, in a boy's voice that belonged to him before worries were put on his shoulders. "I thought everything I set my hand to would turn out wrong." "Some things turn out wrong," Miss Marple said. "They do not, for that reason, belong to you." She saw the way he closed his fingers around the chain and then opened them to look at it again. The small repetition that people make when they are teaching themselves a new truth. Inspector Slack returned from his conversation with Mr. Pettigrew, wearing the look of a man who had found exactly what he expected and would have preferred to be surprised. "He says he found the chain under a pew," Slack reported. "Says he didn't want to cause fuss and thought it best to place it where it would be discovered properly. He is sorry in the way people are sorry that you dislike the taste of their soup rather than sorry for what they put in it." "Then let's be content with the soup," Miss Marple said. "It nourishes Mr. Reed's position and does not poison anyone else." Slack snorted and shut his notebook with a snap that made two old ladies at the far end start and then pretend they had not. Miss Marple, having done the thing she had come to do, took her leave. On the way home she paused at Kersey's shop, not because she needed anything, but because small errands let one look at shelves and faces. Mr. Kersey, who saw more of people's private economies than any other man in the county, offered her a respectful nod. "A sad business, Miss Marple. There's been ladies in here who couldn't bring themselves to buy ribbon because it felt unkind to dress anything at a time like this." "Kindness and ribbon are not mutually exclusive," Miss Marple said, and allowed him to show her a length of narrow navy braid of the sort Emily had taken to trim the cuffs of the jacket Mrs. Penhaligon had turned up. "Did Emily ever look at rings here?" she asked, as if it were a matter of gossip rather than principle. "She asked me once," Mr. Kersey said, "about valuations. Not for herself. She had that practical way with questions. Wanted to know if a pale sapphire was fashionable. I told her fashions come and go, but pale stones suit certain skins. She smiled as if she were agreeing with someone not in the room and went on her way." He hesitated. "There was a cousin in the spring, city lady with thin heels, who tried to sell me a brooch with a chipped blue stone. I didn't take it. Not good enough. She didn't like me for saying so." Miss Marple nodded. The cousin's blade shoes could keep their flicker in the background where they belonged. Emily had chosen her own sense. The village had supplied the stage. The tragedy had not needed strangers. In the late afternoon, Miss Marple took a turn round her little garden and dead-headed a rose that had got above itself. She was considering whether to thin the lettuces when Elsie came up the path, breathless with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. "They found the chain," she said, as if Miss Marple might not have heard. "Mr. Reed's taken it home. He says he'll keep it safe now, not under drawers and nails and such." "That is very sensible," Miss Marple said. "And you, my dear, have you put away Emily's notebook?" Elsie nodded, her eyes bright. "I will keep it until I know what to do with it. It feels like a thing that should be kept until it tells you itself that it can be let go." "You will know," Miss Marple said. "Books do tell one such things. So do gardens." She looked past Elsie to the lane, where the last of the day's light sat on the hedge-tops like a cat. There remained, because there often does, a little business for her own peace. At dusk, she walked once more to Old Post Cottage. The gate, unlatched, gave it the softest push. The chair under the rose had been moved. Someone, perhaps the constable, had put it against the wall, as if the wall might keep it from telling tales. Miss Marple set it back where the grass was faintly satin, laying its legs in the same dim rings. Small restorations matter. They make the ground less confounded. When she turned to leave, she saw a glow in the kitchen. Not a light, but the diminished flame of something extinguished badly. A neighbour had set a saucepan on the step. The kitchen door stood ajar. She went to it, turned the wick down, and stood a moment in the threshold. The room smelled as it had smelled before, of beeswax and lavender. and beneath that, the human odour of a place where someone has done her living. On the table was a half-written list in Mrs. Foster's hand, exactly as even as the label on the honey jar Miss Marple had set hours and days ago. Straining cloths, spare veil, polish. There was an empty space below it where another word had been about to go. Miss Marple did not try to write it for her. Some lists are not to be completed by other hands. On her way back, she met Inspector Slack for the third time that day. The repetition gave him a slightly rueful air. "You have a way," he said, "of being where you ought to be." "It is less talent than habit," Miss Marple said. "One sets one's foot where small things look as if they might have been disturbed." "We'll have your statement about the alms box," he said. "Of course. And Miss Marple." He hesitated, then went on with more courtesy than he usually expended. "I don't say it often, but I will say it this once. You spared us a worse muddle. There's a difference between a village that has had a crime and a village that has had an exhibition of one." She inclined her head. "Exhibitions are for winter bazaars. They are not for grief." He made a sound that might have been agreement and went on his way. When she reached her cottage, the sky had deepened to that tender blue that is almost violet, and one star had found its courage. She set the kettle on, and while she waited for the whistle, laid the pale wool scraps back in their saucer, put the empty ring box beside them, and, after a moment, added a small, smooth pebble she had picked up from the meadow path the first morning, the sort of pebble only a careful walker would notice. It was not a trophy, not even a keepsake, merely a reminder that the ground keeps its own counsel and that one must tread with attention. She poured her tea and took the first sip. In the quiet, she could hear the village settling. A bolt shot, a child laughed and was shushed, a bicycle bell chimed. The case had not ended with a flourish. It had ended as most true things end, in the plain knitting up of consequences, the return of an object to its place, the writing of a name on a parish book. She let the contentment of the ordinary come back and sit down beside her. There would be other disturbances, sooner or later. In St. Mary Mead, as everywhere, human nature provides enough employment for a lifetime. For tonight it was enough that the chain had come home by the gentlest possible route, and that, for a little while, the dust had settled where it would not choke anyone. 2 days passed in the kind of cautious quiet that follows a disturbance. Villagers speaking to one another in lowered voices, shopkeepers wrapping parcels a little more slowly, and children being told, without much explanation, not to play too near the meadow. Miss Marple noticed these changes without surprise. It was the natural way of things after scandal. Yet, as she took her morning walk along the high street, she also noticed a subtle shift. Conversations broke off when she approached, but not out of resentment. Rather with the curious, deferential air people assume towards someone who has been closer to the heart of events than they themselves. She stopped at the post office to collect a letter from her niece, and Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, leaned forward over the counter. "It's a blessing the matter's settled, Miss Marple," she murmured, "but there's still something unsettled in the air, if you take my meaning. Like the smell after you've burnt toast. Gone, but you can't quite forget it." Miss Marple agreed with a small nod. "The village will remember longer than it means to. That is often the way." Outside, the postmistress's words followed her, mingling with her own thoughts. She had indeed felt that lingering tang, the sense of something not entirely finished. It was not a question of who had been responsible for Emily's death. That was as clear as such matters could be. But there were smaller questions, the sort that never make it into the record books, yet have a way of affecting the balance of a place. She found herself turning into the narrow lane that led to Mrs. Penhaligon's shop. The dressmaker was at her window table, mending a tear in a child's pinafore, her foot working the treadle with practised ease. At the sight of Miss Marple, she set her work aside and reached for the tin of biscuits she kept for favoured visitors. "I thought you'd be in before long," Mrs. Penhaligon said, pushing the tin toward her. "I've been thinking about that jacket Emily brought me, the one I altered the sleeves on. I remembered something, and I don't like to keep such things to myself. Miss Marple listened attentively as the woman poured out the details. When Emily had collected the jacket earlier than expected, she had seemed distracted, almost impatient, paying quickly and leaving without her usual polite chat. Mrs. Penhaligon had thought little of it at the time, but now she recalled that the girl had been carrying her handbag tucked closely under her arm, her fingers curled tightly around the clasp. Something in there she didn't want anyone to see? Miss Marple suggested. Could be, Mrs. Penhaligon agreed. And she looked over her shoulder twice before she reached the corner, not frightened exactly, but measuring the distance to something. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly. That detail, the handbag held close, joined itself to a faint recollection of her own, Emily's hymn book with the folded note inside, left in plain sight on the dressing table. It occurred to her that Emily might have had more than one note, and that the second could have been with her on that last morning. Leaving the shop, she walked toward the green, where she encountered Thomas Reed, sanding a chair leg outside his workshop. He looked less strained than he had in days, but there was still a guardedness in his expression. "I meant to thank you," he said when she stopped beside him, "for clearing my name over the chain. I'd hate to leave the village with people thinking I was a thief as well as, well, you know." "Are you still leaving for Dorchester?" she asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "I think I'll stay. There's work enough here, and I suppose someone has to mend the chairs." His smile was faint but genuine. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Did Emily ever confide in you about anyone else she might have been seeing? Not romantically, perhaps, but privately?" He frowned, considering. Once she mentioned talking to Mr. Pettigrew about something she'd found. A trinket, she called it. Said he knew a bit about old church things. But she didn't say what it was, and I didn't ask. I didn't want to seem jealous. That word, and the regret in his tone, settled in Miss Marple's mind like a pin in a map. She left him to his work and made her way to the church, where she found Pettigrew in the porch, polishing the brass candlesticks. "It's good to see them shining again," she remarked, watching the gleam emerge under his cloth. "Though I imagine you've been polishing more than candlesticks lately." He looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "If you mean the chain, I've explained myself to the inspector." "I wasn't thinking of the chain," she said mildly. "I was thinking of the little object Emily showed you before she died. The trinket. Was it a ring, by any chance?" Pettigrew's polishing slowed, the cloth making smaller circles. "I couldn't possibly say. She asked me how old I thought it was. I told her it looked 19th century, maybe earlier, but I didn't see it long. She put it back in her bag quickly, said she wasn't sure yet what she'd do with it." "And did she say where she'd found it?" "No," he said, his gaze fixed firmly on the brass. "Only that it had been somewhere very near for a very long time." Miss Marple let that answer rest. She knew well enough that very near could mean anywhere from a church cupboard to the bottom of a garden drawer. But if Emily had found something that carried enough curiosity or value to show to Pettigrew, it might explain more than one person's interest in her last days. By the time she reached her cottage, the rain had begun in earnest, drumming steadily against the window panes. She settled in her chair, the scraps of wool and the empty ring box still on the table beside her, and considered the pattern again. Mrs. Foster's guilt was plain, but it was possible her act in the meadow had been only the last move in a sequence of smaller ones played by others. Emily's note about Sunday might have been written with more than a romantic intention. The trinket might have been meant as a lever, not a keepsake. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Elsie Cranford stood on the step, rain spattering her shoulders. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, "but I've found something I think you should see." From her bag she produced a narrow envelope, the kind used for photographs, its flap unsealed. "It was at the bottom of a drawer in the tea room," Elsie explained. "I was cleaning out the old linens, and it must have slipped between them. It's addressed to Emily, but there's no name inside. just a photograph. Miss Marple drew out the contents, a small, sepia image of what looked like the interior of a church, pews, a narrow aisle, and at the far end, partially in shadow, the outline of what might have been a carved chest or box. On the back, in a firm but slightly slanted hand, were the words, "Yours before they see it." She felt the pieces shift again, subtly but unmistakably. This was no lover's token. This was a message about possession, about getting to something before others could claim it. And if Emily had been following that lead, she might indeed have found the object Pettigrew described. "Thank you, Elsie," Miss Marple said, tucking the envelope back inside. "You've been most helpful. Sometimes the smallest discoveries tell us that the story we've finished is not quite the whole story after all." As Elsie left, Miss Marple returned to her chair, the photograph resting on the table beside the ring box. Outside, the rain blurred the outlines of the village, but in her mind certain shapes were coming into sharper focus. Whatever Emily had found had stirred more than sentiment. It had stirred caution, secrecy, and perhaps more than one plan to ensure it was never spoken of in the open. The dust had settled for now, but she could feel it still, shifting just enough to suggest that a new breeze might lift it at any moment. And when it did, she intended to be watching. The next afternoon broke bright and clear, the rain-washed cobbles glinting in the sunlight. Miss Marple had spent the morning arranging her thoughts with the same care she would give to her sewing box, each needle in its place, each reel of thread wound neatly. By mid-morning, she sent notes to 3 people, Inspector Slack, Mr. Pettigrew, and Thomas Reed, asking them to meet her at the church. The nave was cool and dim when they gathered, the scent of lilies still lingering from the last service. Miss Marple stood near the vestry door, the photograph Elsie had found resting on the table beside her. "I thought it might be better to end this where it began," she said mildly, "in the place where Emily's last intentions seemed to have taken shape." Slack gave a short, cautious nod. "You've found something, then?" "Not something," Miss Marple corrected, "but the meaning of what was already in our hands. This photograph sent to Emily shows the church interior, and there, in shadow, the carved offertory chest from the side chapel. It has been here longer than any of us can remember, and inside it, well, most assume it holds nothing but old prayer books and oddments. Emily, however, was told otherwise. The message on the back, 'Yours before they see it,' suggested to her that something inside was hers by right or by discovery, and she seems to have believed it." Pettigrew shifted uneasily. "I told you she brought me a trinket. It was a small ring, old, possibly valuable. She said she had found it tucked behind the lining of the chest. I advised her to put it back until she knew more." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "And yet, Mr. Pettigrew, you didn't mention that until pressed, because you feared it would raise questions about the chest, and about who else might have known its contents. Emily took the ring with her when she left that day, meaning to decide later whether to keep it or make it public. That, I think, is why Mrs. Foster's fears grew sharper. She believed Emily might use the ring as leverage, to secure her independence, perhaps even to hasten her marriage to Thomas." Thomas frowned. "But I never knew anything about a ring, except the sapphire pendant I meant to give her." "Exactly," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Foster did not know that. She saw only that Emily had something precious, that she was planning something private, and that Sunday would bring both to a head. So she arranged to meet Emily in the meadow, meaning to take the ring and frighten her out of her plans. It went further than she intended, but she kept the ring nonetheless. When her house was searched after her arrest, the ring was gone. I believe, Mr. Pettigrew, you found it here later and quietly returned it to the chest, telling yourself it belonged to the church." Pettigrew's lips pressed into a thin line. "I thought it best to restore it. It was never meant for bargaining." "And yet," Miss Marple said, "secrecy always breeds more danger than truth. Emily's death began with fear. Fear of scandal, fear of change, fear of losing control. It is a very old motive, and often the most destructive. Slack cleared his throat. So the ring is back where it started, the chains return to Reed, and the rest? Well, the rest is in the record books. That's as tidy an end as we're likely to get. Miss Marple closed the photograph inside its envelope and set it atop the chest. Tidy enough, she agreed, but not so tidy that we forget the cost. Emily Foster will not come back, and the village will remember her in its own ways. Some kindly, some not. What we can do is leave things in their proper places, so that no one else is tempted to stir them again. The sunlight through the high windows had shifted, laying long bars of gold across the flagstones. Pettigrew bowed his head. Thomas stood straighter, and even Slack, for once, found nothing to add. Miss Marple gathered her gloves and stepped into the brightness outside, the voices of the three men murmuring behind her. The air smelled of wet grass and new beginnings. She knew that before long, another matter would arise, some quarrel, some small deception. But for now, the village was quiet. And that, she thought, was resolution enough.